With the death of Brigham Young, eyes across the nation turned to the peculiar yet prosperous community in the Utah Territory. How could anyone fill the shoes left vacant by this powerful leader who had led his tormented people across the untamed wilderness of America and built a virtual empire out of the lone desert valleys in the Great Basin? Who could replace this historic colonizer, administrator, and prophet?
Outside the membership of the church, speculation was rampant. Newspapers, politicians, and church leaders of other faiths wondered if a descendant of Joseph Smith would now return to the helm. Still others offered President Young's sons as successors, for two of them were even members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. But among the faithful members of the church, there was no question. The pattern had already been established, and the Lord himself had prepared the one who would preserve the great latter-day work. As the senior member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, John Taylor made the transition smoothly and faithfully into his role as the new leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Guided by the Lord since the days of his youth, John Taylor had nearly 70 years of life lessons to prepare him for this sacred office. Certainly no one could replace Brigham Young. But clearly, there was one who could carry on where he left off, and that was none other than President John Taylor.
In the quaint town of Millenthorpe, north of Preston, England, James and Agnes Taylor had a son on November 1st, 1808. The boy was their second son, and they named him John. When he was an infant, John's parents had him baptized in the Church of England, and he grew up memorizing the prayers and catechisms of the old established religion.
John was taught by his parents about God and the Bible, which he read often, even though he was just a boy. He even saw a vision during his childhood of an angel holding a trumpet to its lips to announce a message to all nations. An image which is seen today atop almost all LDS temples in the gold-plated statue of the angel Moroni.
John was raised to be ever mindful of offending the Spirit of the Lord. One day, while flying a kite, John became very upset at another boy who pulled his kite down and ruined it. But what upset him more was his own reaction to the encounter. He remembered,
I felt very angry and said, "Damn." As soon as I had uttered the word, I felt very much alarmed at what I had said. I left my kite lying on the ground and ran home crying and told my mother what I had said and asked her if she thought the Lord would forgive me.
John also grew up believing in the power of prayer. When he was 10 years old, he succeeded in convincing his parents that he was old enough to make a long, tiresome journey to the home of a family friend named Ali to deliver some food. After spending a few hours with the kindly gentleman, John realized it was late and he needed to get home. When Ali offered to walk the boy home, John refused on account of not wanting his parents to think he could not complete the task on his own.
Not long after the boy started his return trip home, a heavy, thick fog engulfed the hillside on which he was traveling. Confused by the fog, John took a wrong turn on the path and became lost. Frightened by the noises of the countryside, and not knowing where he was, John recalled the teachings of his mother and knelt down on his knees. No sooner did he finish his humble prayer for help than he heard the voice of his friend Ollie calling to him from the fog. His plea to his Heavenly Father answered, John gladly allowed Ollie to accompany him home to his family.
Oh, goodness, I found you. I thought you'd been lost out here.
I was.
Okay. Let's get you home then.
When John was 11, the family settled on a small farm in Hale, Westmoreland. He learned about hard work as he labored with his family on their farm. He recorded,
I got mixed up with plowing, sowing, reaping, haymaking, and other farm work. And I have indelibly impressed on my mind some of my first mishaps in horsemanship in the way of sundry curious evolutions between the horses' backs and terra firma.
John Taylor's boyhood in the main was spent close to the Lake District, one of the most beautiful spots of England. His father, James, had inherited a little farm in Hale and a wayside inn where travellers would stop. The family never occupied the inn, they rented it out, and they lived in Hale for much of the time, where they had pigs and some fruit trees and geese and various other things that are mentioned in the tithing records. John went to school at Beetham, a small grammar school, and when he was there, he would study Latin and Greek literature and some of the classics. But in the research that we did into the school at that time, it was interesting to find that they had had quite a turnover of teachers, one of whom only lasted 12 days. And my son, when doing the research, commented, I wonder if John's pranks had contributed to this quick turnover of teachers.
At 14, John left the farm and moved to Liverpool, where he was apprenticed to a cooper. The city was an active seaport, and John learned much of the world during his stay there.
When John was a teenager, he was apprenticed to a cooperage in Liverpool, England, and went to live in the big city for the first time. And one of his favorite activities after work was to go to the local pub to join with the men in conversation. And while there, he became acquainted with a Mr. Winters, who had been a professor and quite a knowledgeable man. And one time, Mr. Winters had had a little too much to drink, and John felt that he should escort him home because he was stumbling and couldn't walk very well. So he helped him to his home. When they got to the Winters home, Mrs. Winters opened the door and took one look at her husband and realized that here he was in this condition again. And she looked at John and said, "This is a terrible thing, lad. Don't ever let the bottle get a hold of you." And John never did go into a pub again.
A few months later, his employer lost the business, and John decided to move to Penrith to learn the trade of a turner. Yet in this serene and breathtaking valley, surrounded by England's tallest mountains, young Taylor's vocational interests were overshadowed by inspirational thoughts and experiences that would forever affect his character and disposition.
Penrith is one of the most beautiful places in England. In fact, some people think it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. It was here that a lot of English poets went for their inspiration, such as Wordsworth and Thomas Coleridge and some others. And so while John Taylor was working in Penrith, he too was inspired. He read a lot of classical literature while he was there, particularly Shakespeare and Milton and others. And as he went through the lakes and the valleys, I'm sure he thought about intellectual things as well as spiritual things. And it reminds me that maybe this is one of the places where he got some of his early intellectual interests. But later on, he himself became a great literary person. In fact, one of his great contributions to the church in later years was his wonderful book called Mediation and Atonement, which is a very thoughtful book. I don't know that he had the ideas in Penrith, but at least he became attuned to both intellectual and spiritual things while he was there.
In Penrith, John turned from the catechisms he had faithfully learned by rote as a boy and searched in his heart for a more personal and complete religious connection to God. He studied the Bible regularly and soon joined with the Methodist Church in an effort to discover a friendlier faith. He recalled,
Most of my leisure hours were spent in reading the Bible, works on theology, and in prayer. I went into secluded places in the fields and woods, in barns and other secret places. I also got together boys of the same age to join with me in secret prayer, but they generally soon forsook me.
Not long after this, 17-year-old John was called as a lay minister for the Methodist Church. As John walked with a fellow preacher to speak in a nearby town, he felt a distinct impression from the Lord. He stated,
I have a strong impression on my mind that I have to go to America to preach the gospel. A presentiment that I could not shake off clung to me, that I had some work to do, which I did not then understand.
After completing his training as a turner, John left Penrith and returned to Hale to start his own business with the aid of his father, intending to stay only long enough to prepare for a journey to America. In 1830, John's parents emigrated to Toronto and Upper Canada, leaving John behind to settle some business affairs for the family.
It's interesting to note the contribution of England to the church. The Reformation had made England a land of very diverse, many different kinds of religion, much more than Germany or France. Because of that, the people were used to freer choices. They were very receptive to the missionaries, and they joined the church by hundreds and thousands. John Taylor is the only president of the church born in England. He immigrated to Canada and was converted by Parley P. Pratt. Not only did England contribute this marvelous man as a president, but the ancestors of all the presidents of the church had English extraction. They came from England.
In 1832, John was finally ready to join his family in America and follow the call of the Spirit to preach there. With his ship caught in stormy seas so severe that several similar vessels were sunk around him, John's faith did not falter. He recorded,
So confident was I of my destiny that I went on deck at midnight and amidst the raging elements felt as calm as though I was sitting in a parlor at home. I believed I should reach America and perform my work.
Landing in New York City, John Taylor finally set foot on American soil. After a few months in Albany and Brooklyn, he eventually made his way to Toronto, where he was reunited with his parents. Eager to fulfill his calling, John quickly joined with the local Methodists and set about preaching from the Bible.
One of the bonuses that came to John Taylor when he was preaching in Canada, as he was working with the Methodists, was that he met a woman named Leonora. And Leonora caught his eye and he fell in love with her. And he asked her to marry him. And Leonora, a very dignified, articulate, well-educated woman, turned him down. And I can imagine he was devastated, but he didn't give up. Leonora had been born on the Isle of Man, educated in England like he had, so they had a great deal in common. And he went back to her. In between that time period, she had a dream, much like a vision, I think, where she had the prompting that she could see herself married to John Taylor. And the second time he asked her, she said yes.
John and Leonora were married in January 1833 and lived in a small home adjacent to John's shop. With his furniture-making business, John supported his new bride, and within a year, he was also supporting his new son, George John, who was born in January of 1834. But preaching the gospel remained an important part of John's life, although his support for the Methodist faith was waning. One Sabbath day, after Leonora had listened to him give a speech in which he mentioned his call from the Lord to come to America, she brought up a question which had obviously been on his mind as well.
Are you not now preaching the gospel in America?
Aware that something was missing, John's response combined both the discouragement and the hope which he felt.
This is not the work. It is something of more importance.
About this same time, hundreds of miles south in Kirtland, Ohio, Elder Parley P. Pratt was preparing to leave his sick wife, a half-finished home, and a pile of debts to heed the call of the Lord to serve a mission in Canada. Heber C. Kimball had prophesied great success for Parley on his mission and had also promised instant health to Parley's wife, Thankful. Therefore, Parley faithfully set out. And interestingly, The first missionary visit he made in Toronto was to the home of John and Leonora Taylor.
John listened patiently to the eager missionary, but was so skeptical that he turned Parley away. Finding no success elsewhere, however, Parley soon returned, this time only to say goodbye. He had been unable to find a church or public building that would allow him to preach, and he felt he had no choice but to return unsuccessful to Kirtland. However, in the room next to the shop where John and Parley were talking, Leonora was entertaining Isabella Walton, a widow who attended John's Bible study group. Overhearing Parley's plight, Mrs. Walton offered her home not only as a place for Brother Pratt to stay, but also as a place to preach.
John, why don't you come in here?
In Isabella Walton's parlor, Parley was finally able to teach the gospel in Canada. His daily sermons were attended by many in the community, and most importantly, by John Taylor. At the first meeting, Brother Taylor also felt compelled to address the small congregation.
Mr. Pratt has come amongst us without purse or scrip, as the ancient apostles traveled. I desire to investigate his doctrines and claims to authority, and if I find his religion to be true, I shall accept it no matter what the consequences. And if false, then I shall expose it.
Elder Pratt was invited by a clergyman named Patrick to participate in the Bible study group that John Taylor had been attending. At that night's meeting, John read from Acts chapter 8, the account of Philip healing and teaching in Samaria. Before opening the discussion, he stated,
Now where is our Philip? Where are the signs and the miracles? Where is our Peter and John? Where are our apostles?
Thank you very much. We all believe in Jesus.
Following this meeting, John began an in-depth investigation of the Book of Mormon. And having written 8 of Pratt's sermons down word for word, he compared them carefully with Christ's teachings in the Bible. He recorded,
I made a regular business of it for 3 weeks and followed Brother Parley from place to place.
After much prayer and study, John Taylor was converted by the Spirit. His faithful wife, Leonora, had independently come to the same conclusion. And on May 9th, 1836, they were both baptized as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Not long after his baptism, John was given the priesthood and ordained as an elder. Clearly, that prophetic call of the Spirit to a sincere young man in Penrith, England, so many years ago, was being fulfilled. He was finally beginning to preach the true gospel in the lands of America.
In just a short time, the work initiated by Parley P. Pratt began to flourish in Toronto, and apostles Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt were called to assist in the spreading of the gospel throughout Upper Canada.
After a fruitful summer of sharing the gospel, Elder Pratt returned to Kirtland, leaving John Taylor to preside over the newly organized branches in Canada. Early the next year, John and several brethren from Toronto journeyed south to Kirtland so they might meet and be instructed by Joseph Smith, the prophet.
When John arrived in Kirtland, the atmosphere was tense. Hard economic times had swept the nation in recent months, causing many banks to go under, one of which was the Kirtland Safety Society. Many of the saints were angry with Joseph Smith, who had served as the chief officer of the failed institution. The spirit of apostasy hung heavy. Even Elder Parley P. Pratt was frustrated by personal financial loss.
Although he was just a new convert, John Taylor's testimony was not challenged by the naysayers around him. and he was influential in turning his friend Parley Pratt around. He stated,
"If the work was true 6 months ago, it is true today. If Joseph Smith was then a prophet, he is now a prophet."
His faith strengthened through challenge, John Taylor soon left Kirtland and headed north with his brethren for the Canadian branches.
During this difficult period, John Taylor was anxious to go back to Canada to strengthen the branches there that he was so fundamentally important in establishing. And it was during this time that a very significant spiritual experience happened for John Taylor personally, and also would have ramifications for the future church. As the party traveled to Upper Canada, they stopped at the famous Niagara Falls, and there found a secluded place, a cliff, and there began to pray. And during this spiritual, empowering moment, John Taylor had his first experience with speaking in tongues. He had apparently witnessed it before, but this time he actually spoke in tongues. And during this intensely spiritual moment, he had an impression that he would someday become a member of the 12 apostles, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. This was embedded into his heart and profoundly affected his own spirituality as he prepared for this great calling in the future.
Upon his return to Toronto, John found that a brother named Samson Avard had assumed control of the church in Canada. He presented John with a document signed by some brethren in Kirtland giving him authority over the church in that area. New to the priesthood, John accepted the gentleman at his word and allowed Mr. Avard to direct the work in Toronto.
In the fall of 1837, Joseph Smith visited Toronto along with Sidney Rigdon and Thomas B. Marsh. Joseph's first meeting was with John Taylor, where he soon discovered how Samson Avard had deceived John and the saints. Joseph took immediate action to straighten things out. He reprimanded Brother Avard for his actions, and even reprimanded John a little for giving up his authority so easily. When the prophet returned to Kirtland, John was again left to preside over the church in Canada.
Soon after this, in the fall of 1837, 29-year-old John received a letter from Brother Joseph calling him to the 12. Remembering his experience at Niagara Falls and the one as a boy in England, John's faith in the mission of the restored gospel solidified. He stated,
"The work seemed great. The duties arduous and responsible. I felt my own weakness and littleness, but I felt determined. When I first entered upon Mormonism, I did it with my eyes open. I counted the cost. I looked upon it as a lifelong labor, and I considered that I was not only enlisted for time, but for eternity also."
As a newly called leader in the church, John Taylor felt a desire to gather with the saints and be close to the prophet. However, because of the cloud of hatred and persecution that hung over Kirtland, Joseph asked John to take his wife and 2 children and settle in far west Missouri, where the body of the church would soon be assembling.
Because John had devoted so much of his life to serving the church and to preaching, his wood-turning business was ready to fail. And yet he prepared for departure. And his wife, Leonore, asked him, "John, how can you go without any means?" And he simply said this, "I don't know, but I know the Lord will open the way." And this was the standard by which John Taylor operated throughout his life, no matter how difficult or impossible the situation which faced him.
Shortly before they were to leave, a friend of the Taylors, a Mr. John Mills, announced that he too was going to Far West and that they could travel with him at no cost. With his faith rewarded by an open door, John loaded his family into a converted sleigh and set out for Missouri in January of 1838.
Their journey was a slow and deliberate one, as John could not pass up any opportunity to preach. At one stop near Columbus, Ohio, John exhibited his loyalty to the gospel. After hearing that Elder Taylor had scheduled a meeting in their town, a group of angry locals decided to attend the service and then afterward tar and feather the Mormon preacher. Despite learning of their plans, John decided to proceed. Standing confidently, John began to lecture on the blessings of freedom and on the valor of those who fought for America's liberty. After setting the tone, he addressed his would-be attackers.
I have been informed that you propose to tar and feather me for my religious opinions. Is this the boon that you have inherited from your fathers? Is this your liberty? Gentlemen, come on with your tar and feathers. Your victim is ready. Come on, I say, I am ready. Come on with your tar and feathers.
Well, after that very brave speech, John Taylor just stood there, and the crowd just stood there, and nobody moved. And finally he went on and talked for 3 hours. This only suggests what kind of a man he really was. He was courageous, he was spiritual, people were spellbound at the talk that he gave. I don't know that anybody joined the church out of it, but the point is that he was in charge, and he knew he was in charge because he had the Spirit with him.
This was the great contribution. This is one of the things that John Taylor needs to be remembered for. He was bold, he was courageous, he defended that which he thought was right. Here's a man who had something to say and knew how to say it. He was eloquent. He was able to communicate through the pen and through his speeches and his sermons. And this is the moment of courage, and this is what he'll be known for, a man of courage, a defender of the truth.
While John avoided a confrontation that night, it would not be long before he had his first experience with the dreaded mobs of Missouri. In 1837, while he was staying in DeWitt, a band of marauders arrived under the command of 2 ministers. John was outraged by the event.
I had no arms and heretofore considered that I needed none in a Christian, civilized land. But I found I had been laboring under a mistake. The civilization here was of a very low order, and the Christianity of a very questionable character. I therefore suppressed my repugnance to fighting, borrowed a gun, and prepared myself at least for defensive measures.
The small group of DeWitt Saints, 24 in number, bravely prepared to battle the 150 angry mobbers. Intending to divide and trick the saints, the reverend heading the mob sent a message suggesting that several of the Mormon leaders meet with them for a friendly discussion. After the saints rejected their proposal, the mob backed down and gave them 10 days to leave before they attacked.
Having survived their first encounter with a mob, the Taylor family, now 5 in number due to the birth of another son, soon left DeWitt and made their way into Far West. Although John had received his call to the apostleship almost a year earlier, it wasn't until he reached Far West and attended the October Conference of 1838 that his call was sustained by the membership of the church. And it was not until December 19th of that same year that Elder Taylor was finally set apart for this holy calling by Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball.
Not long after his arrival in Missouri, John was called upon by the prophet to begin what would turn out to be a lifelong literary career as a champion of liberty for the church. His early writings were reports to the governments of both Missouri and the United States, outlining the many persecutions and injustices suffered by the saints.
However, within weeks of John's ordination to the apostleship, it fell upon the quorum to lead their weary but faithful followers to yet another home. Joseph and Hiram had been imprisoned in Liberty Jail, and the governor of Missouri, Lilburn W. Boggs, had issued his infamous extermination order. In January of 1839, the Taylors loaded their few belongings back into their wagon and headed out with the rest of the saints for Quincy, Illinois.
At about this same time, Joseph Smith and the other brethren in Liberty Jail were allowed by the sheriff to escape while being transported for a trial. They quickly made their way to Quincy and began the process of moving the saints further up the Mississippi River to Nauvoo, Illinois.
Lacking many options for a suitable home, John Taylor decided to settle his family in an abandoned army barracks across the river in Montrose, Iowa. His wife Leonora was no doubt grateful that many others chose to do the same. And although the mighty Mississippi separated them from the rest of the saints in Nauvoo, it did not offer any protection from the outbreak of malaria that summer, which plagued the budding city established on its swampy banks. When John was finally able to leave for his mission to England on August 8, 1839, he left behind a wife and 3 children, all of whom were sick and fevered with malaria.
When John Taylor finally arrived in New York City, he came arriving after a long bout of illness, and he was left with only 1 penny to his name. When some of the brethren asked him about his financial situation, he simply said, "I have plenty for my needs." And so when Parley Pratt heard this, he went to John and he said, "John, I need $200 to $300 to publish some pamphlets." And John said, "Are you willing to accept whatever I have?" And Parley said, "Why, yes." And so John reached into his pocket and pulled out his penny and dropped it into the palm of a very surprised Parley P. Pratt. But that was John Taylor. He was always willing to sacrifice whatever he possessed to build the kingdom of God.
As you know, most of the members of the Quorum of the 12 were really in poverty as they were trying to make their way to New York and then on to England. And they relied on members of the church to give them a place to stay and to give them something to eat and sometimes to make donations to help them on their way to England. They were really traveling without purse or scrip. And John Taylor was no exception, but he didn't let anything stand in his way of doing what he had to do at the moment. He even went to the extent of telling his friends, "Go ahead and book passage for me and Brother Theodore Turley on the ship that's going to England. We'll be able to pay our passage." And they didn't have any money, but sure enough, by the time they were ready to go, through miscellaneous donations of one sort or another, they had enough money, just barely, to pay their passage to England. That was the faith of John Taylor.
After 4 weeks at sea, the elders landed in Liverpool, England on January 11, 1840. They then traveled to nearby Preston for the first meeting of the 12 apostles outside of North America. Elder Taylor was directed to serve in Liverpool and also assigned to assist in compiling a hymn book for the British saints, as well as to help publish the Book of Mormon in England.
While in Liverpool, John took the opportunity to preach and debate the doctrines of the gospel whenever and wherever he could. Often he would be invited to preach at an established chapel, only to be dismissed by the ministers after members of the congregation began to take an interest. Undeterred, however, John exhorted those who would listen to enter the waters of baptism, and within a year he reported that there were more than 200 saints in the Liverpool branch.
As his fellow missionaries around the country were having similar success, an unexpected situation developed among the converts of Great Britain. No sooner were the people baptized than they were ready to board a ship and join with their brothers and sisters in the New World.
Because John was serving in the port city of Liverpool, it often fell on him to help organize and assist many of the anxious converts as they migrated across the ocean. The mass migration notwithstanding, there were thousands of faithful converts and an organized branch in nearly every notable town across Great Britain when John Taylor and the other apostles boarded a ship on April 20th, 1841 for their own trip to America.
John was grateful to be united again with his wife, and as quickly as he could, he set about establishing a comfortable home for her and their 3 children across the river in Nauvoo.
In the fall of 1843, the prophet revealed to several select brethren in Nauvoo the doctrine of plural marriage.
And, like almost all the brethren of the time, John found the very idea of this practice appalling and unthinkable. He wrote,
"I had always entertained strict ideas of virtue, and I felt that this was to me outside of this principle. The idea of going and asking a young lady to be married to me when I had already a wife. It was a thing calculated to stir up feelings from the innermost depths of the human soul. Nothing but a knowledge of God and the revelations of God and the truth of them could have induced me to embrace such a principle as this.
The concept of celestial marriage was underpinned by plural marriage, and when John Taylor was first taught this principle by Joseph Smith, it was difficult for him to understand. It rubbed in the face of all of the things that he had understood to be appropriate and true for a marital relationship. But because it came from the prophet, he took it very seriously. I think it was very hard for John Taylor's wife, Leonora. John Taylor, was 35. Leonora was older than he was. She was about 47. And I think it was very difficult for her initially. John Taylor talked about the difficulty that he had and that other members of the Quorum of the 12 had. This was not something they just snapped up. But I think obedience ruled. I think that they recognized that Joseph was a prophet. And I think that in the process of that, accepted the principle and began to live it.
After the initial struggle that was common among all the wives of these chosen brethren, Leonora placed her faith in the Lord's hands and accepted the doctrine. It was decided between the two that John would ask the hand of Leonora's younger cousin, Elizabeth Kagan. And on the 12th of December, 1843, John and Elizabeth were married.
Officially, John Taylor had 7 wives, but recent research has dug up the fact that there were 10 more, making a total of 17, and very possibly there are others that we do not know about.
As if the concept of plural marriage were not difficult enough simply to be lived by the faithful in Nauvoo, it also served to incite the hatred and focus the prejudices of enemies of the church in the nearby communities. Former friends of the prophet, such as John C. Bennett and William Law, helped stir the feelings of intolerance that were sweeping across the country and becoming major issues in the upcoming national elections. Disturbed by the lack of interest in the saints' plight shown by all the declared candidates for president, Joseph Smith decided to run for the office himself and asked John Taylor to be his campaign manager. In an article in the Nauvoo Neighbor, John colorfully outlined the reasons for Joseph's campaign.
One great reason that we have for pursuing our present course is that at every election, we have been made a political target for the filthy demagogues in the country to shoot their loathsome arrows at. We refuse any longer to be thus bedaubed for either party. We tell all such to let their filth flow in its own legitimate channel, for we are sick of the loathsome smell.
2 months later, at the April Conference of 1844, Joseph asked for volunteers willing to travel east and campaign for him. 344 men stepped forward, and they, along with 10 of the apostles, began to travel the countryside on behalf of their candidate. Not included in this group were Willard Richards and John Taylor.
When Joseph Smith was sending all these brethren out into the nation, he decided to keep Willard Richards and John Taylor home in Nauvoo to help him lead the church, to help him manage the campaign, and of course to allow John Taylor to continue to edit the 2 church newspapers in Nauvoo.
Very few of these missionaries who left, Brigham Young included, and some of the 12, would have ever imagined this was the last time they would have seen the prophet Joseph Smith. So it remains for Joseph and Hiram and John Taylor and Willard Richards to remain behind. And of course, John Taylor and Willard Richards will be witnesses of the massacre in Carthage.
On June 7, 1844, the various enemies of Joseph and the church combined their efforts and printed the only issue of the inflammatory newspaper, The Expositor. The lies and hatred put forth in that issue led the City Council of Nauvoo, which included John Taylor, to declare it a public nuisance and subsequently have the press destroyed.
The destruction of the press only agitated the mob atmosphere that was already beginning to build, and this in turn led Nauvoo's mayor, Joseph Smith, to declare martial law in the city. Sensing a situation spiraling out of control, Governor Thomas Ford ordered Joseph Smith and the entire city council to travel to Carthage and answer several charges stemming from the destruction of the expositor's press. It was under this cloud that on the morning of June 24th, John Taylor accompanied his friend, mentor, and prophet to the ominous Carthage jail.
After 2 days of fruitless meetings and mock justice, all of the brethren, with the exception of Joseph and Hiram, were freed to return to Nauvoo. John Taylor and Willard Richards, however, would not abandon their friends. On June 27th, as the heat of the afternoon and the melancholy of the approaching events settled on the upstairs room of the Carthage jail, the prophet asked Elder Taylor to sing his favorite hymn, A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief. John sang all 14 verses of the song, and then sang it again at the prophet's request.
It was John Taylor who first saw the mob emerge from the surrounding woods. A moment later, he stood by the door with a wooden cane, knocking aside the rifle barrels as they tried to shoot the prophet. Sensing the futility of his efforts, John ran for the window and tried to leap out.
As he got near the window, he was shot in the thigh of his left leg from the doorway. That ball, he said, severed a nerve or hit a bone or something because it paralyzed him literally. He could not move a single muscle of his own volition. But his momentum carried him to the windowsill, which is about 18 inches wide, and he was there nearly on a balance, tilting slowly outward. He looked down, and there were 50 men below with guns and bayonets waiting, and he could not do a thing to stop himself from falling. But one of those men chose not to wait. He took careful aim at John Taylor's heart and fired a ball. That ball smashed into the watch in John Taylor's vest pocket right over his heart, stopped it at 5:16 and 26 seconds, and knocked him back into the room. It saved his life. He hit the ground then in the room, found he could move again, and crawled under the edge of the bed in that corner. But now, with the doorway open, he could be seen quite clearly, and those men in the doorway began to shoot at John Taylor as he lay on the floor on his face, with his head toward the east wall. He was shot in the wrist of the left hand, the calf of the left leg, and a piece of flesh the size of that fist was shot out of his hip as he lay there on the floor.
When the smoke finally cleared and John was pulled from under the bed, Joseph Smith, the only prophet the church had ever known, and his brother Hiram the Patriarch, lay dead. The finality of the death of his friend and leader came as a severe blow to John. He recorded his feelings.
I felt a dull, lonely, sickening sensation at the news. It seemed as though there was a void or vacuum in the great field of human existence to me, and a dark, gloomy chasm in the kingdom, and that we were left alone. Oh, how lonely was that feeling! How cold, barren, and desolate!
The vicious mobs that had hounded the followers of the gospel since its restoration did not wait long after the death of Joseph to renew their attacks on the church. John, who was now the editor in charge of the Times and Seasons, continually defended the church against its enemies until the saints left Nauvoo in 1846. His style was much less aggressive and more literary and subtle, and he introduced a wry sense of humor as he poked fun of the enemies of the church. In fact, John's wife, Leonora, made a habit of studying each edition of the newspaper to find the jokes John had put in.
But despite all attempts to live peacefully amongst their enemies, the saints soon realized that they would need to abandon their beautiful city on the river. Leonora Taylor recorded her feelings during this difficult period.
The way seemed to me narrower every day. Without his almighty power to help me, I cannot walk in it. To whom shall I go or look for succor? But unto thee, my Father and only friend.
When John left Nauvoo on February 16, 1846, his family included 4 wives and 3 children. They loaded their belongings into 8 wagons, crossed the river into Iowa, and began the long and difficult trek toward the Rocky Mountains. As difficult as the journey was, Elder Taylor refused to be discouraged by the obstacles placed in his path. He recalled,
"Our cattle and horses suffered very severely from exposure. We ourselves had frequently to endure the fury of the pitiless storm, the drifting of snow, the pelting of hail and rain, and the icy chills of storms and tempests, but we sustained no injury therefrom. Our health and our lives were preserved. We outlived the trying scene. We felt contented and happy. The songs of Zion resounded from wagon to wagon."
On the 17th of June, John's company arrived in Council Bluffs, Iowa, with the hope of leaving for the Rocky Mountains immediately. However, word reached the camp that there was trouble in the branches across the Atlantic that would require immediate attention.
When the brethren began to prepare for the trek west, Wilford Woodruff was in charge of the church in England, but he left England to come back and participate in the trek west, and left a man by the name of Reuben Hedlock in charge of the church in England. And one of the things that Brother Hedlock did was to try to set up some kind of fund to help the saints emigrate from England to the United States.
In 1842, the Quorum of the Twelve had initially proposed a joint British and American stock company that would be organized in both America and Britain, that would be able to produce woolen goods, for example, in England, bring them to the United States, and pay for them through the sale of lands in Nauvoo. And the idea was very good, but it didn't really catch on. After the martyrdom, Reuben Hedlock and several others in England decided to sort of start up the idea more or less on their own, and because of the believing saints, were able to gather a lot of money, up to probably 1,600 British pounds, as far as we can tell. The problem was the money disappeared almost as fast as it was got. Reuben Hedlock was later brought to task for this and couldn't account for over 600 pounds of the money. Well, John Taylor was one of those individuals that was sent back to England to help solve the problem that could, if not checked, led to much, much more serious problems.
On July 31st, 1846, John Taylor again left his wives and children, sheltered only by tents and wagons, and joined Elders Parley P. Pratt and Orson Hyde as they traveled back to England. Reuben Hedlock, who fled before the apostles arrived, was quickly excommunicated.
After meeting with and comforting the British saints throughout the Isles, the brethren boarded the ship America on the 19th of January, 1847, and began the return trip to their families. Elder Taylor brought with him several scientific instruments that were needed for the migration west, as well as his 5th wife, Sophia Whitaker, whom he married on the ship.
Upon their return to winter quarters, the elders learned that Brigham Young had departed just days earlier with a small group of pioneers. John and his friend Parley P. Pratt were to prepare the main body of saints to follow soon after. On the 21st of June, 1847, the company of 1,553 souls finally began the difficult journey across the hot, dusty plains. John recorded,
"I might talk of trials, afflictions, and so forth, but what avails it? They're the common lot of men. They are momentary and pass away, and are not to be compared with the glory that is and shall be revealed. And I have not time to think, speak, or write about them."
On the 5th of October, Elder Taylor's company entered the Salt Lake Valley and beheld for the first time the stark, untamed desert that was now their home. John built a split log home, and within months was able to move his growing family, which now included his sixth wife, Harriet Whitaker, into their humble home before the harsh winters set in.
That first year in the valley brought many difficulties for the saints. When spring finally broke, they carefully planted thousands of acres of vegetables and waited anxiously for the rains. To their surprise, the rains came, and so abundantly that some homes were flooded. But the unexpected rain was not the biggest catastrophe the early settlers faced. That summer, as the well-watered crops began to flourish, hordes of crickets moved in.
The defenseless saints tried to fight off the infestation with sacks, brooms, blankets, and ditches of water. Finally, the pioneers turned toward their Heavenly Father in prayer for help, and He delivered an endless flock of seagulls from the nearby Great Salt Lake. In this trial and the miracle that saved them, John Taylor was able to see at work an eternal principle of God. He stated,
God is determined, if possible, to make something of us. In order to do this, He has to try us and prove us, to manifest principles unto us, to show us by placing us in various positions and subjecting us to various trials what we are, to show us our weaknesses and follies, in order that we may be made to lean and depend upon Him alone.
John always had a very positive and faithful attitude. In the fall of 1849, he was asked to travel to France to do missionary work there. And while he and his companions were crossing the plains, they were robbed, and they lost everything. They lost their blankets and food and clothing by a band of Indians. Later on, when John commented on the experience, he said, "We weren't robbed, we were tithed." And then he made this humorous observation: "We rather preferred to be tithed by our own bishops than to be subjected to the ordeal by those who officiate without authority."
Elder Taylor's difficulties did not end when he got to France. His missionary efforts were complicated by the fact that the country was going through a very difficult political transition. The rumblings of a coup were in the air, and meetings of more than 20 people were not permitted. Still, on the same day as a controversial national election, John held a conference of the church, which was attended by over 400 saints. He remembered,
At the very time they were voting for their president, we were voting for our president and building up the kingdom of God. And I prophesied that our cause would stand when theirs is crushed to pieces. And the kingdom of God will roll on and spread from nation to nation and from kingdom to kingdom.
The next day, John Taylor left Paris for England. And unbeknownst to him, not 10 minutes after he left, a police official inquired for him at the house in which he had been staying. The gentleman of the house, along with his sister-in-law, detained the officer for 2 hours with stories and conversation, thus allowing the Mormon elder to make significant progress on his journey.
Although this mission to France resulted in the establishment of branches in many of the larger cities across the country, Elder Taylor found himself increasingly frustrated by what he saw as a preference for the philosophies of men over the teachings of God among the French people. One day, while walking through a park, John and some companions purchased a particular kind of cake. It was described as being so thin and light that you could eat it all day and not be satisfied. One of the party asked Elder Taylor if he knew the name of it.
No, I don't know the proper name, but in the absence of one, I can give it a name. I call it French philosophy or fried froth, whichever you like.
Despite the difficult circumstances, John did meet with some measure of success. And perhaps the greatest achievement of his European mission was the overseeing of a combined translation of the Book of Mormon, containing both French and German. When Elder Taylor finished his mission and returned to Salt Lake City in August of 1852, His arrival marked the end of his days as a proselyting missionary for the church. The Lord now had other duties for his apostle, duties that would fine-tune his talents as a preacher and a writer.
When the saints first arrived in the valley, their primary objective was simply survival. There were settlement sites to be selected. They needed to build forts to protect themselves from the Indians. They needed to build homes, of course, plant crops, dig ditches and canals to bring water into the desert fields that they were planting. All of this took a lot of temporal concern, and after a few years, the leaders of the church began to feel that the saints needed to be reminded of their spiritual duties.
At the April Conference in 1853, Brigham Young assigned John Taylor and several other apostles the task of reactivating and remotivating many church members who had lost their way. John traveled to nearly every established township in Utah and encouraged the saints to recommit themselves to the gospel and the church by being rebaptized.
But at the same time as Elder Taylor was laboring to build up and strengthen the kingdom, the long silent enemies of the church were once again beginning to clamor for its downfall. Fueling the fire of the Eastern public's mistrust of the saints was the church's public acknowledgement of the doctrine of celestial marriage and its inclusion of plural wives.
In an attempt to combat the growing tide of ill feeling sweeping the country, Brigham Young dispersed several brethren around the country to publish newspapers which would depict the church in a more favorable light. One of whom was John Taylor, who was sent to New York City. In a letter to the Millennial Star, John Taylor discussed the need for these regional newspapers.
Hitherto we have not meddled in politics. Our missions have been strictly religious. As our religion embraces everything that pertains to the happiness of the human family, we are now entered fairly into the political arena, for there is as great a development of old Dame Babylon's confusion in the political as there is in the religious world.
On February 17, 1855, the first issue of the Mormon reached the streets of New York City. Across the masthead, it read, "It is better to represent ourselves than to be represented by others." The editors of neighboring papers around the city wasted no time in attacking John and the rest of the saints. But Elder Taylor stood strong and refused to let them slander the church facelessly from behind their presses. He wrote,
We defy all the editors and writers to prove that Mormonism is less moral, scriptural, or philosophical. We call for proof. Bring on your reasons, gentlemen, if you have any. If you don't do it, and you publish any more of your stuff, we shall brand you as poor, mean, cowardly, and liars.
When John Taylor was editing the newspaper called The Mormon in New York City, representing the point of view of the church, he responded to the critics, and he didn't mince words. He was very forceful in his editorials, and when he came home after that experience, Brigham Young complimented him and thanked him for his service in that capacity, and he said John Taylor was a strong editor, and that the Mormon was one of the most strongly edited newspapers he had ever come across. That does describe John Taylor as a writer and as an editor.
For over 2 years, John labored as the editor of The Mormon, while also serving as president of the Eastern States Mission. But in the spring of 1857, developments out west necessitated John's return to the Salt Lake Valley.
Several non-member federally appointed officials fled Great Salt Lake City and reported to President James Buchanan that the Saints were in utter rebellion, that they had burned down a courthouse and destroyed important records. Buchanan immediately ordered a large contingent of the U.S. Army to come out to put down the rebellion and to replace Brigham Young as governor.
When John returned to Salt Lake City that summer, he met with the other members of the quorum and helped devise the plan of action taken by the saints. They would harass the approaching army, abandon their homes, and prepare to burn their city to the ground. And if necessary, they would flee into the wilderness once again. John Taylor's feelings on the situation were common among the saints.
I do not desire trials. I do not desire affliction. Lightnings flash, the thunders roll, and the powers of darkness are let loose, and an evil influence is brought to bear on the saints, and my life, with theirs, is put to the test. Let it come. For we are the saints of the Most High God, and all is well. All is peace, all is right, and will be, both in time and in eternity.
In 1857, the United States Army was coming from the east to Utah to settle what they considered a people who were anti-United States government. And so the Mormons prepared for the worst. And they built walls in Echo Canyon to hide behind, to shoot down from the mountainside at the approaching army in case there was a war. Well, the Mormons had fled Salt Lake City. They left their homes ready to burn if the army did come in. Well, in the meantime, a peace task force came to Utah, and they settled the affair without fighting. And Jesse Gove, a newspaper correspondent, summarized this whole period of the Utah War with these words: killed, none; wounded, none; fooled, everybody.
At home, John Taylor was a loving and fair father, but he was also quite meticulous and particular. Each of John's sons was expected to do his share in preparing and caring for the family's garden. Once, Elder Taylor instructed one son very carefully to properly prepare the ground, measure the rows, and evenly space the seeds. The son, wanting to play, took shortcuts, which became apparent when the seeds began to sprout. The rows were all over the place. Elder Taylor called the boy over to see the results of his labors and said, "Well, we are not very proud of this, are we? We had better dig it up and start over again."
On another occasion, John held a family court to decide a matter involving some apples and chickens stolen from a neighbor.
Eggs and stealing chickens and apples from the next door neighbor, Brother Wolford. Can you believe that? What are we going to do about that?
The family found that several of John's sons were guilty, and they were sentenced to pay back 7 times the value of the stolen items in labor on the neighbor's farm.
For the next week for free at Brother Wolford's home.
Somehow chickens seemed to play an important part in John Taylor's life. One day he went out walking in his yard and he noticed there was a strange chicken. He did not believe it was his. He was a man of complete integrity, and so he picked the chicken up and threw it over the fence to his neighbor Wilfred Woodruff's house, believing that the chicken had escaped. When John returned from his walk, there was that strange chicken back in his yard. Woodruff had thrown it back over the fence because it wasn't his chicken. In his concern and haste to maintain his honor and his record of integrity, he had not taken time to identify the chicken as his own, but just simply picked it up and tossed it over the fence.
At home, the Taylor children were permitted to play checkers, jackstraws, and other simple games, but they were forbidden to use face cards or read novels. John demonstrated his great character and humility when on one occasion his son won a copy of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea for being the best scholar in the school. When President Taylor observed the boy reading the book, he scolded him and sent him to bed.
You go to your room without supper.
The next morning, the boy woke up to find his father still in the parlor, having stayed up all night reading the novel.
I owe you an apology.
Showing his ability to admit his misjudgments, President Taylor stated,
Will you forgive me?
"That's a good book, son. You may read it."
Here you go.
With the Utah War behind them, the Saints no longer face the physical threat of troops. However, the moral and legal invasion into their way of life seemed only to intensify. In an effort to use his talents for the benefit of the people, John Taylor served in the Utah Territorial Legislature from 1857 until 1876. And for a short time, he even served as a probate judge in Utah County, no doubt a welcomed influence in opposition to the tainted and prejudiced officials sent out by Washington. It was also during this time that his beloved and faithful wife, Leonora, passed away.
Despite the efforts of Elder Taylor and others, the national government persisted in its efforts to break up the church and quash the practice of plural marriage. In the spring of 1871, James B. McKean was sent to the Utah Territory as the new Chief Justice. Seeing his appointment as a mission to destroy the Mormons, he soon made his intentions quite clear. Judge McKean's first trumped-up indictments were, of course, against leaders of the church, including Brigham Young, who was charged with 16 separate violations of the anti-polygamy laws. Again, Elder Taylor responded quickly in the press, writing 5 editorial letters in the Deseret News.
Stripped of all its tinsel and wrappings, it simply resolves itself into this: that the government of the United States is at war with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
In the meantime, the U.S. Supreme Court was unable to find law supporting the supposed illegality of the plural marriages. McKean's indictments were dropped, and he was eventually removed from office.
In spite of the flurry of politics surrounding polygamy, the church continued to move forward in its divine mission. In June of 1875, Brigham Young called the 12 apostles together to settle a question of seniority.
An interesting thing happened at that meeting that really accounts for the fact that later on, John Taylor became president of the church. John Taylor was third in seniority in the Quorum of the 12. Ahead of him were Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt. But the problem was, and this is where the confusion came in, that Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt at one time had been dropped from the Quorum of the 12 Apostles during the days of Joseph Smith. Well, when the two came back into the Quorum of the 12, they were put in their original seniority.
So the issue was the first ordination the basis for seniority, or was the second ordination? And here, Brigham Young's this momentous decision was that seniority in the 12 was based on continual service in the 12, uninterrupted service. Therefore, Orson Hyde and Orson Pratt's ordination, their second ordination, became the basis for organizing the senior members of the 12. And thus, John Taylor became the senior member of the 12, and thus prepared him to become the president of the church following the death of Brigham Young.
Just over 2 years after establishing this policy of seniority in the 12, President Young passed away on August 29, 1877. At the funeral in the tabernacle, Elder Taylor not only honored his venerable predecessor, but also spoke with great faith concerning the future of the Lord's latter-day work.
We are not alone. God is with us, and he will continue with us from this time henceforth and forever. While we mourn a good and great man dead, I see thousands of staunch and faithful ones around me and before me who are for Israel, for God and his kingdom.
Just over a month later, with the brethren of the 12 gathered together for October Conference, a reorganization of church leadership took place. Following the precedent established at the death of Joseph Smith, the first presidency was dissolved and the authority was returned to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. They in turn unanimously sustained John Taylor as the new president of the Quorum and the trustee and trust of the church's business holdings.
The administration of President Taylor can best be described as energized and focused. John moved quickly as the new leader of the 12 to strengthen the priesthood quorums throughout the church. He mandated that bishops in all the wards have priesthood meetings each Sunday, and that the stakes hold conferences every quarter. Both of these practices proved so valuable that they are continued in some fashion even today. Also of great importance to the new president of the 12 was the work for the dead, which could only be conducted in a dedicated temple. To further this work, John laid cornerstones for 2 new temples, one to the north in Logan in 1877, and the other to the south in Manti in 1879.
The year 1880 marked the 50th anniversary of the organization of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In ancient Israel, it was custom to celebrate every 50 years with a jubilee, and so President Taylor organized a jubilee for the church. An important aspect of the jubilee in biblical times was the forgiving of debts, and John Taylor honored their former tradition.
President Taylor first relieved the debts of converts who had borrowed money from the church to come from foreign lands to the territory of Utah. In all, John Taylor forgave over $800,000 for saints that had borrowed money from the church's perpetual immigration fund. He also relieved half of the tithing indebtedness of poor church members and gave instructions for stakes to provide livestock and grain for poor Latter-day Saints.
Toward the close of 1880, another magnificent event took place in the life of John Taylor. In the October General Conference, a solemn assembly was held. There, in the historic tabernacle, the priesthood quorums and general membership of the church sustained John Taylor as the third prophet and president of the church. As his counselors in the first presidency, John chose George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith.
As the church gained strength in these times, so too did their enemies. In the East, the national government, still afraid of the Mormons' power in the Utah Territory and blinded by their prejudice, continued to draft legislation that would limit the religious freedom of the saints and punish them for their beliefs. In the spring of 1882, the Edmunds Act was signed into law. This legislation denied polygamous Mormons the right to vote, hold office, and to participate in juries. Furthermore, it made plural marriage punishable by both weighty fines and imprisonment.
Realizing their helpless condition, President Taylor counseled the saints in the April Conference of 1882.
Let us treat the Edmunds Act the same as we did this morning in coming through the snowstorm. Put up our coat collars and wait till the storm subsides. After the storm comes the sunshine. While the storm lasts, it is useless to reason with the world. When it subsides, we can talk to them.
For 2 years, the government gathered evidence, and in 1884, it began its indictments against the defenseless Mormon polygamists. Federal officials moved slowly at first, testing the strength of the Edmunds Act in court. Finding initial success, however, the federal marshals rapidly expanded their indictments. Raids were conducted at all hours of the night, with husbands and their wives dragged embarrassingly from their own homes and forced to testify against one another in open courts.
On February 1st, 1885, John appeared unannounced at the government-guarded Salt Lake Tabernacle to counsel his people concerning the latest trials laid before them. Unbeknownst to him or the congregation, it would be President Taylor's final public appearance. He boldly addressed the mistreatment and injustice the Latter-day Saint Church had received from state and national governments since its organization more than 50 years before.
When little children are set in array against their fathers and mothers, and women and children are badgered before the courts, when wives and husbands are pitted against each other and threatened with pains, penalties, and imprisonment if they do not disclose that which among all decent people is considered sacred. When such a condition exists, it is no longer a land of liberty, and it is certainly no longer a land of equal rights.
President Taylor finished his address by advising the members to take care of themselves and to avoid being caught in the government's snares. And then, following his own counsel, John went directly from the tabernacle into hiding, never again to be seen alive by the body of the saints. For the next 2.5 years, President Taylor led his people through writings and word-of-mouth messages while living on the run in the underground.
John Taylor was a man who lived his life without compromise or concession to the revealed laws which inspired his motto that ruled his life, the kingdom of God or nothing. And because he was such a staunch believer, he was willing to spend the last 2.5 years of his life on the underground. And during this period, he was moved from home to home for his safety while the federal deputies were trying to track him down. I don't think we realize the terror of the times, the ruthlessness, the fact that pistols were always in the belts and ready to be shot. In one instance, he needed to go from Kaysville to Centerville, and they knew that the roads were heavily guarded. And Taylor came up with the idea of putting himself in a shipping crate and shipping himself to this home in the other city, and it worked. He got there safely.
John Taylor always had the company of bodyguards as he was traveling around from place to place while he was in hiding. He usually moved at night, and it was quite an entourage. It wasn't just a lone man, a dark figure moving about, but it was the office of the president, essentially. I thought it was particularly telling about John Taylor and the Times that he would communicate with the saints through correspondence, through memorandum essentially, and then he would have those delivered by some of the people that worked with him. There were telephones here in the territory, but John Taylor never used them. He was much more comfortable always working with the pen.
John's counselors were also in hiding. George Q. Cannon managed to be with John during much of the time he was in exile, while Joseph F. Smith was sent to work with the saints in Hawaii.
Near the end of 1886, President Taylor made his final move to a farm west of Kaysville, which was owned by Thomas F. Rouchet. Honored by the opportunity to aid their prophet, the Rouchet family moved into a small cabin on the farm and gave the entire farmhouse to President Taylor and his staff for their makeshift headquarters. To avoid the searching eyes of his persecutors, but at the same time enjoy exercise and fresh air, President Taylor sometimes resorted to going outside and feeding the chickens while disguised in a woman's dress and bonnet.
The Rouchet farm was strategically a very good place for John Taylor to hide. It was out on the flat lands, so you could see for a long way around it, and you could have advance warning of any of the federal marshals who might be coming to arrest him. He had control of most of the farmhouse. It was large enough to accommodate his staff, and so he could function pretty well with the First Presidency. President Cannon was there with him, and it was the best situation the First Presidency had had for a time. But no matter how good the situation was, there was still two things that mattered most to John Taylor that he missed very deeply: his freedom, which he had had all his life, and the association with his family.
This life on the run began to take its toll on President Taylor, who was now nearly 80 years old. The constant moving at night, being unable to exercise because he couldn't get out during the day, and then, of course, the constant stress of possibly falling into the hands of the federal officials really took its toll on the president.
Besides the physical difficulties, there were emotional difficulties. He heard that his family was having trouble. Two of his wives were ill, and he couldn't go see them. Actually, one of his wives, Sophia, passed away during this time, and he was devastated that he could not be with her at her bedside.
By the beginning of 1887, President Taylor's condition started to deteriorate rapidly. Lacking any strength, John passed most of his presidential duties to his counselor and friend, George Q. Cannon. By July, it became clear to President Cannon that the end was near. He sent for Joseph F. Smith to return from Hawaii. When Joseph F. Smith arrived at the Ruche farm on July 17th, President Cannon took John's hand and told him that with Joseph there, it was the first time in over 3 years that the first presidency had been together. To this, President Taylor finally responded with a tired whisper.
I feel to thank the Lord.
John lived for another week before passing away. His last words were, "Joseph, Joseph."
On July 25th, 1887, exactly 40 years and 1 day after the Mormon pioneers entered the Salt Lake Valley, their third prophet passed through the veil. President Taylor's body was then taken to the Gardo House in Salt Lake for family and public viewings prior to the funeral held in the Tabernacle on July 29th.
Elder John W. Young of the 12 Apostles requested a temporary reprieve from the government indictments of Wilford Woodruff and President Taylor's counselors so that they might attend the funeral, but it was denied. And consequently, only 3 members of the 12, who were not being hunted because of plural marriage, were able to attend John's funeral. However, his 2 faithful counselors were able to communicate their grief with the saints and the world through a statement published in the Deseret News.
By the miraculous power of God, President John Taylor escaped the death which the assassins of Carthage jail assigned for him. His blood was then mingled with the blood of the martyred prophet and patriarch. He has stood since then as a living martyr for the truth. But today, he occupies the place of a double martyr. President John Taylor has been killed by the cruelty of the government of the United States. And though we have lost his presence here, his influence will still be felt. Such men may pass from this life to another, but the love which beats in their hearts for righteousness and for truth cannot die. John has gone, but God lives. Cherish this in your heart of hearts and live each day so that when the end of your mortal lives shall come, you may be counted worthy to go where Joseph, Brigham, and John have gone and mingle with the glorious throng.
Looking upon his life, it is clear that John Taylor was a man of God. Heeding the call he received of the Spirit as a young lad in England, John never doubted the great latter-day work as he preached and defended the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And though he was persecuted, shot, mocked, and exiled because of his beliefs, he remained ever faithful in his service to the God of this world and the next. And he was truly deserving of the title, Champion of Liberty.